Arizona Territory, 1887. Winter came early that year, cruel and sharp as a knife. In the dusty town of Canyons Bend, a weary rancher named Daniel Boone watched a starving widow and her little boy dig through garbage for food. He went to help her, but when he heard her story, he was shaken to the core. Watch till the end, partner, to uncover why this woman was starving alone with her child, and what grief she carried in her heart. Tell us where you're watching from, join our Sleep West family, and now, let's ride into the story.
It was late November of 1887 in the Arizona Territory, and a biting wind, sharp with the promise of heavier snow, swept through the dusty thoroughfare of the small hardscrabble settlement of Canyons Bend. The rancher, a tall, imposing man named Daniel Boone, guided his worn wagon away from the general store. He was not a man given to sentiment, his face usually set in the granite lines of perpetual labor and the lonely grief of a life lived too long without joy. His attention snagged on a small figure near the back of the mercantile building. A young woman, perhaps 25, was crouched low to the frozen ground. Beside her stood a boy, his face pinched with hunger, who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. They were scavenging through the debris heap behind the store, picking up discarded, bruised, and rotting fruit, mostly apples too soft or decayed for sale. The sight of the child raising a worm-eaten piece of apple to his mouth, eyes wide and focused entirely on the meager prize, struck Daniel with a sudden unwanted pang of pity. Daniel Boone had seen hard times, but this looked like desperation's last gasp. He pulled his wagon to a halt, the squeal of the wheels echoing in the quiet street. Dismounting, he approached them slowly, trying not to spook them. "Ma'am," Daniel said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't eat that rot, you'll poison yourselves." The woman, Nora, startled, immediately shielded the boy. Her eyes were a fierce, wary blue, framed by dust and exhaustion, and she looked at him with the suspicion of a trapped animal. She wore a dress that had once been decent, but was now threadbare and caked with mud. "Keep away," she said, her voice dry, barely a whisper. Ignoring her command, Daniel walked back to the store, paid a little extra for a half-dozen of the best, firmest red delicious apples available, and returned with a small bag. He didn't offer them, he simply held the sack out. "Here, clean, fresh, and paid for," he stated. Nora hesitated. Then the need in the boy's eyes overcame her pride. She snatched the bag. The child didn't chew, he tore into the apple, devouring it in frantic, silent bites, as if any pause would allow the food to vanish. Nora herself ate with the same terrifying urgency. This wasn't hunger, it was starvation they were fleeing. When the first apple was gone, and the terrible tension had eased from their shoulders, Daniel spoke again. "What's your name? Where do you hail from? And what misfortune has set you to picking through garbage?" Nora merely clutched the boy tighter, his face sticky with apple juice. "Thank you for the kindness, sir. We are fine now." Her response was a stone wall politely deflecting. She was used to relying on no one. Daniel looked around at the rapidly darkening afternoon, and the heavy gray clouds. "Fine? It's going to blizzard by midnight. You'll freeze in that alley." He paused, his gaze fixed on her defiant yet worn features. "I have a house, a big, empty one. Plenty of food, a warm stove, and a roof that doesn't leak. You and the boy could eat a proper meal and sleep in a clean bed." He added a decisive, blunt caveat. "I'm not looking for anything. I need help running the place, honestly. If you can cook a meal and wield a broom, you earn your keep." Nora studied him. His eyes were tired but honest. The offer was too simple, too direct, but the alternative was a desperate night under a freezing sky. She finally nodded, a stiff, small motion. "I agree, sir. My name is Nora, and this is my son Owen." The journey to the Ironwood Ranch was short. The house was a sturdy, log and stone structure, utilitarian and clean, but utterly devoid of feminine softness. Daniel ushered them in, pointing to a small, unused washroom. "Get yourselves clean. There are fresh clothes, my late wife's. They should fit well enough. They're good wool. Burn those rags you're wearing." When they were clean, Daniel presented a meal: thick, smoked bacon, eggs fried in butter, fresh sourdough bread, and a pot of steaming, hearty bean stew. Seeing the plate piled high with real, substantial food, Nora's composure finally broke. She didn't look at Daniel. She simply bent her head, and the silent, heavy tears began to fall. I haven't seen a meal like this in almost a year," she choked out, the words catching in her throat. "We thank you, Mr. Boone, truly." "Eat," Daniel commanded gruffly, uncomfortable with the display of emotion. "Plenty more where that came from. When you're done, take the room down the hall. Get your rest." Nora and Owen stayed. What Daniel had initially offered as a night's shelter turned into a week. Nora was a whirlwind of quiet, efficient energy. She didn't just manage the kitchen. She conquered it, turning his bachelor's mess into an ordered, aromatic sanctuary. She mended torn linens, scrubbed the grit from the windows, and even brought a semblance of order to the barn, her movements quick and focused. When Daniel returned from a long day checking his winter herd, the sight that greeted him was jarringly unfamiliar. The house was warm, smelling of pine and roasting meat. A clean, white cloth covered the table, and a delicious supper of roasted venison and root vegetables was waiting. He stood in the doorway, staring. "Nora, you don't have to do all this. You're welcome to stay as long as you need regardless." Nora wiped her hands on her apron. "A debt paid is no debt. I cannot simply accept charity." After supper, as the snow outside began to fall thick and soundless, they sat by the immense stone fireplace. The quiet rhythm of the fire was broken only by Owen's gentle snoring asleep on a sheepskin rug. It was the first time they had truly spoken beyond necessary logistics. Nora's eyes drifted to a small silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a smiling, gentle-faced woman. "Your wife?" she asked softly. "What happened to her?" Daniel picked up the photo, his thumb tracing the faded image. "Fever, 3 years ago. Took her in a week. They say time heals, but it just replaces the pain with silence." Nora nodded, understanding written plainly on her face. Silence can be louder than any scream. The opening of his past seemed to unlock her own. She began to speak, her voice low and even, reciting a story of betrayal and loss. "I was married to a good man, a fine, gentle rancher. We had a small piece of land near Whisper Creek, a modest life, but peaceful. After my husband died suddenly in a flash flood, his family, my mother-in-law and his younger brother Silas, turned on me." Her jaw tightened with suppressed fury. "They viewed me as an obstacle. They claimed I was a poor caretaker and unfit to raise Owen. They forced me to do all the drudge work, cleaning their house, milking the cows, scrubbing floors, all while managing a baby. They acted as if the child didn't exist." She stared into the flames, her narrative gaining a hard edge. "My husband had legally deeded a specific portion of the land to me, a small, valuable grazing area. They took it. They simply rewrote the records through coercion. When their cruelty turned from neglect to outright abuse, when they began hitting me for small mistakes, I knew my patience had broken. I took Owen in the dead of night, with only the clothes on our backs, and we ran. We walked for days until we reached Canyon's Bend. We were hunting for any kind of work, but no one trusts a woman alone." Daniel listened, his own eyes beginning to well up, a reaction he hadn't felt in years. The quiet dignity with which she told her tragic tale of injustice was devastating. "You are safe here, Nora," he said, his voice firm, echoing in the quiet room. "You don't have to go anywhere. This is your shelter now." As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. Daniel saw in Nora a strength and resilience that matched his own frontier spirit, and Nora saw in Daniel a quiet, uncompromising decency. Owen, finally receiving consistent nourishment and warmth, began to blossom, filling the old house with the sound of childish laughter. It felt, for the first time in years for Daniel, like a home. One afternoon, Daniel rode into Canyon's Bend for supplies. He was stopped near the livery stable by a group of men, local ranchers who eyed him with hostile disapproval. Jasper Calloway, the most outspoken man in the group, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the frozen dirt. "Boone, we hear you're keeping a young widow woman out at your ranch." Daniel remained seated on his horse, his expression unreadable. "I am. That ain't seemly, Daniel." Calloway sneered, adjusting his hat. "You're a man of respectable standing. A respectable man doesn't shelter a lone woman and her whelp outside the bonds of marriage. It brings suspicion upon you both." Daniel finally looked him in the eye, his voice low and steady. "I offered them shelter. In return, I have a clean house, hot meals, and my son doesn't starve. That's the simple truth of it." He gave Calloway a cool, dismissing look. "I have work to do, gentlemen. Good day." And with that, he simply rode off, leaving the men to their muttering. He didn't share the encounter with Nora, but he knew the conversation had changed things. The isolation of the frontier was often broken by the judgment of neighbors. Several days later, a sharp, authoritative knock hammered on the Ironwood Ranch door. It was evening, and Daniel and Nora were again by the fire, talking about plans for spring planting. They heard the heavy crunch of boots on the snow-covered porch. Daniel opened the door to find the Sheriff Samuel Yates and 2 armed deputies standing on his doorstep. "Boone," the sheriff said, his tone official but hesitant. "We've had some complaints from the folk in Canyon's Bend. Says you're harboring a woman of questionable reputation. It's causing a stir, Daniel." Daniel stepped out onto the porch, blocking the view inside. His stance was solid and movable. "A questionable reputation? I found that woman and her child picking rotten apples out of a garbage pile to survive. Did any of the respected citizens of Canyon's Bend offer her work? Did anyone offer her a corner of a barn or a cup of stew? No. They drove her to the brink of starvation." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't care what idle gossip my neighbors spread. She is here because I offered a hand when no one else would." The sheriff rubbed his chin, looking uncomfortable under Daniel's piercing glare. "Well, Daniel, the long and short of it is, folks are saying you're living in sin. If you intend to keep her under your roof, you'll have to make it proper." Daniel felt a sudden, profound clarity. He looked over the sheriff's shoulder, past the deputies, and saw Nora standing inside the doorway, her face pale but resolute. He turned back to the sheriff, his posture straightening. "Sheriff Yates," Daniel announced, his voice ringing with a new resolve. "Tell the people of Canyon's Bend that their moral concerns are duly noted. I will resolve this issue to their satisfaction." He stepped back into the warmth and took Nora's hand, pulling her gently toward him. "We won't satisfy their judgment by driving you out. We will satisfy it by standing together." He looked into her intense, beautiful blue eyes. "Nora, you brought warmth, laughter, and light back to a dark and lonely place. You brought a home back to me. Will you marry me? Not for shelter but for us, to start a life, honestly and truly." Nora's eyes glistened with unshed tears. This time they were tears of hope, not desperation. "Yes, Daniel," she whispered, squeezing his calloused hand. "Yes, I will." Daniel turned back to the men on his porch. "Sheriff," he said with a small, challenging smile, "you can tell the good people of Canyon's Bend that the wedding will be in a week's time. We are making it proper." The sheriff, caught off guard, finally managed a hesitant smile. "Congratulations, Daniel. That's the best resolution I could have hoped for." And so Daniel Boone, the solitary rancher, and Nora, the resilient widow, were married. They lived out their lives at the Ironwood Ranch, their love story a testament to the fact that kindness, resilience, and true companionship could thrive even in the harshest landscape of the American West. The shelter Daniel offered Nora ultimately became the foundation of his own happiness.